our first guest is Zachary Siegel. He is a contributor to The Appeal, which is a publication that focuses on mass incarceration. He's going to talk to us about good old Joe Biden. Zachary, are you there?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Oh, you're right here. Hi. Welcome to TYT Conversation. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. So I wanted to talk to you about an article that you wrote last year about Joe Biden and specifically his legacy when it comes to the war on drugs. And a piece of legislation that's sort of, I guess, shorthandedly called the Crack House Law. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So, I mean, it sounds bizarre that we're talking about crack houses in 2020. But basically, the crack house statute was part of a moral panic around drugs back in the late 80s and early 90s. And it basically stipulates that anyone who is owning or operating or managing a building that facilitates the use of drugs is wherever drugs are going down in this building, that means whoever's on the lease or whoever's running this building, they're liable to be criminally prosecuted. And so the crack house statute, it foundationally it sounds racist. Like we think of crack houses as being in urban cities, and there's no crack houses in the suburbs. But people also smoke crack in the suburbs. But
Sure.
No one who owns a house in the suburbs is being prosecuted for doing it in their home.
Right. Right, and so where does Joe Biden fit into this? This was, I understand, kind of his bill, and it was specifically prompted by a death at a rave.
So yeah, like it's really funny how this all happened, and not funny, but just how crack houses were sort of a panic in the late 80s and early 90s, and then going into the 90s and 2000s. That's when the next drug panic, raves, began. And so there's something called the Rave Act, which is actually like an outgrowth of the crack house statute. It basically has the same rules that if you're owning a concert venue and people are doing drugs in there, then you as the owner, you're also liable for whatever illegal activity is going down in that venue. And so the Rave Act is short for the not super subtle Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy Act. And so, yes, Joe Biden wrote both the crack house statute and the Rave Act. And, why we're talking about this now is really important because I cover public health with an eye toward drug policy. And as of late, some of the biggest public health threats are not from infectious disease, but from what economists have called deaths of despair. So overdose deaths, excessive drinking, and tragically suicide are causing so many deaths that our nation's life expectancy has declined. And that our policy solutions have been zero tolerance and draconian and punitive. And this clearly doesn't work. We need a different approach. And these laws are interfering with policy solutions to our drug crisis now.
Yeah, as I was reading your article, I thought that was interesting about the impact of those crack house laws and then this Rave Act, which was that targeting not only the people who rent out spaces and maybe, obviously without a lot of their knowledge, there is drug activity inside of those spaces, but that people who sell things like water at events like raves could be held liable for or could be implicated under this law. That could be illegal, which technically makes the rave a lot less safe.
Exactly. Also glow sticks are considered paraphernalia. It's really absurd. And so for The Appeal, at the behest of my editor, Ethan Brown, I looked into the case of Disco Donny, who was a rave promoter. He threw like big parties in New Orleans at the State Palace Theater. Raves, we now call them festivals and EDM. So he was sort of integral and foundational to this culture. And he was the first rave promoter to ever be criminally indicted for throwing a rave. And he was prosecuted under the crack house statute.
Wow.
And when that case really fell apart and they couldn't make the case against him because he was a rave promoter, he was not a drug dealer. And there was a vast conspiracy that he was making a lot of money off of selling drugs at the parties he was throwing. It just didn't hold water.
Right.
And so the case fell apart. Yeah.
So what is the impact of that legislation passed in '86, right? Now in 2020, what is happening and how is this crack house law being implemented?
Yeah, so as I was saying, there's a massive wave of overdose deaths right now. And why we're talking about this now is because of a recent court case in Philadelphia. So there's an organization called Safe House. They're a nonprofit, and they were trying to open what's called a supervised consumption site. And basically what this means is that people can use drugs under medical supervision and avoid fatal overdoses. So these sound kind of radical and kind of counterintuitive, but really they're effective interventions grounded in harm reduction and public health, and they're prominent throughout Canada and also across Western Europe. And because of the crack house statute, because of these laws that Biden wrote that are on the books, the Department of Justice sued Safe House to keep them from being able to open one of these facilities. Because if you own where drugs are being used, then you are technically in violation of the crack house statute. At least that was the argument that the U.S. attorneys in Pennsylvania put forth, but it didn't hold up. And the judge ultimately decided that no, these facilities do not facilitate the use of drugs. They prevent people from dying and give people critical health care.
Right. Right, and that goes back to what you were saying about this logic of criminalizing drug use and also even criminalizing the sale of drugs, which doesn't have necessarily the impact that I think most Americans would imagine that it does, right? And we've seen obviously the ways that it disproportionately incarcerates people of color and all of that, but can you just sort of further that? I know you talk a lot about these myths that we have in our minds about criminalizing the sale of drugs. Why is that misguided?
Yes. So I recently wrote another piece for The Appeal about drug dealing and how we need to rethink the way that we view people who sell drugs. So these laws and the rhetoric that gets them passed and used is often about how we're going after major traffickers and we're going after these, big international criminal organizations. But the research clearly shows that these laws are applied to people at the very bottom of the drug trade. These are people who cannot get jobs in the mainstream economy. These are people who've never been given a chance, and they're quite entrepreneurial, and they do have skills and have trade and know how business works, but they can't get out of the underground economy. So they continue to sell drugs, and that's who these laws are being applied to. And it's not El Chapo. Like, yes, we did capture El Chapo, but the drug trade did not stop with his capture. People are still using drugs, and whether you're getting the kingpin or getting the people at the very bottom, the drug laws are not having their intended effect. They're just locking people up, and people are still using.
Right. I mean, we've all seen The Wire, and if you haven't seen The Wire, go back and rewatch The Wire to understand how
The Wire was right.
how criminalizing drug sales works. Back to Biden a little bit. What is his response now? 20 years after, or more than 20 years after this law has passed, is he trying to walk back his stance around the Rave Act or like the crack house statute? And do you feel like he's trying to rewrite and maybe sort of own up to some of these bills that have had a negative impact when it comes to stopping drug use?
Yeah, so at this point in the campaign, sadly, we're not talking about raves and crack houses. I, as a drug policy reporter, wish we were. But really, at the very beginning of the campaign, he sort of went on like a half apology tour. He said that some of the crack laws that he did write were indeed harmful to the Black community, and he did own up for that. And I think since that the Democratic Party has really championed criminal justice reform as of late, and even like the Koch brothers are trying to buy some goodwill with criminal justice reform. That the needle has moved so far on this recently that I feel like someone like Biden, whose views might be a little outdated, really has no choice in this but to get on board. But when it comes to things like supervised injection sites, I haven't heard him make a peep about this, whereas Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang, they have all explicitly come out in favor of supervised consumption sites. And I've asked the Biden campaign where they stand on this, and really just haven't gotten a straight answer yet.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. And it's also incredible that we've come this far in the last 20 years. I mean, we've seen just how much the war on drugs has failed, how much it's criminalized entire communities, and the work that you're doing is excellent. And you have pushed the needle, and you see that, as you're saying, in some of these front runner candidates who are seriously taking harm reduction as a viable alternative to what we've been seeing. Thank you so much, Zachary Siegel. Let's find your work on the appeal and follow you. Where can we follow you?
At Zach Wright Stuff.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Zach. Take care.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.